This is a presentation about simple moral arguments, or syllogisms, how to find them and how to evaluate them. So if you observe how people reason about moral issues, you often hear things like this. Somebody says, doing this is morally wrong because, and then they give their reasons. Somebody says, this action is a moral obligation, since, and then they say why. Somebody says, acting this way is morally permissible, after all, and then they make their case. So here's some examples about controversial issues. Somebody says homosexuality is wrong because homosexuals can't reproduce. Somebody says helping children, starving children, is a moral obligation since we can help them. Finally, somebody argues it's morally permissible, that is not wrong, to eat meat. After all, animals aren't rational beings. So in this presentation, we're going to formulate arguments like these as simple moral arguments or syllogisms and evaluate them. So what are arguments? An argument is a conclusion that's said to be supported by at least one premise, or a premise or premises that are said to support a conclusion. So arguments always have conclusions and they always have at least one premise. If you don't have both, you don't have an argument. So if you were to ask why or why think that, the that would be the conclusion and the why would be the premise or premises. So our concern for this presentation is trying to figure out, are the previous arguments sound or not? And what do we mean by a sound argument? A sound argument is a logically valid argument, and the premises are true. What do we mean by logically valid? This is a technical term, has a special meaning in philosophy, and logically valid means this. There's a chain of reasoning from the premises to the conclusion. Perhaps I should add, it's an unbroken chain of reasoning from the premises to the conclusion. So, given this chain, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. And why is that? Well, because there's this chain, because the premises lead to the conclusion. Another thing true about logically valid arguments is that you can't have true premises and a false conclusion. Why is that? Well, because if they are true, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true as well, so you can't have true premises and a false conclusion. Another thing about logically valid arguments is that they are of a pattern or form where the argument is logically valid. So, our concern is, are these arguments sound or not? That is, are they valid and are the premises true? And if the premises are true and if they're valid, that would mean the conclusion is true as well. So, let's take a look at these arguments, stated premises and conclusions. Here we had premise 1, homosexuals can't reproduce, therefore homosexuality is wrong. Second argument, premise 1, we can help starving children, therefore helping starving children is a moral obligation. Finally, premise, animals aren't rational beings. Conclusion, therefore eating meat is not wrong. Alright, so for all these arguments, you could wonder, what exactly is the connection between the premise and the conclusion? Suppose somebody is just puzzled. I don't understand how you get from the premise to the conclusion. What's the connection? What's the relationship? So this presentation is going to be about finding that kind of connection and evaluating that kind of connection. So these arguments aren't logically valid yet, the previous ones. Why is that? There's not really a chain of reasoning from the premise to the conclusion. It's not clear why, if the premise were true, then the conclusion would be true. So it's not really obvious why the premise is a reason, much less a good reason, in favor of the conclusion. Somebody could see the stated premise and just be puzzled, not understanding why this is supposed to be a reason for the conclusion, because they don't understand the connection. Okay, so the full or complete pattern or form of the reasoning or argument is not stated. So what we're going to do is fix these arguments. Let's make them logically valid. Let's make it clear how the premises lead to the conclusion. And to do this, we're going to make a syllogism. So to do this, we're going to look at some non-controversial examples first to try to illustrate the point, get the concepts clear, and then we'll go back and apply them to our more controversial examples. So here's the standard example that everybody's heard 10,000 times. Socrates is a man, therefore he's mortal. State this a little more formally. Premise 1, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is really simple, but somebody could wonder, what's the connection between the premise and the conclusion? Somebody could be puzzled. I just don't understand. Socrates is a man, therefore he's mortal. How did you get from premise 1 to the conclusion? I'm so confused. conceivably there could be such a person and we want to help them out, and the way we help them out will help us with the more controversial arguments. Alright, so let's state this argument in logically valid form. Premise 1, Socrates is a man, and then we can add a variety of things to get to the conclusion Socrates is mortal. We could add all men are mortal, or any man is mortal, or we could add if someone's a man, then that someone is mortal. You can pick any. Any will do, so it just sort of depends on your preference. And actually throughout this little presentation I will present these premises both in their all versions and the if and then versions. I think it's good to have the all or any if you're going to go with the first route on the top, basically because if you write just men are mortal, conceivably somebody could wonder, well, are you saying just some men are mortal or all of them? Now, of course you would mean all, but so just to make things totally clear, just say all men are mortal, or any man is mortal, so nobody's confused thinking you're just saying some men are mortal. The problem with adding some men are mortal would be if you combine some men are mortal and Socrates is a man, you can't really infer that Socrates is mortal because you don't know if Socrates is among those some men who are mortal. So, again, adding these red premises makes the argument logically valid, and it puts it in the form of argument known as syllogism. Okay, so let's visualize the pattern. So I have some little pictures that should come in. Oh, here we go. So Socrates is a man. All men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So I put these little boxes over the parts. So Socrates, of course, has the blue square, and then the property or characteristic of him being a man is in red. Then the second premise says anything with the characteristic of being a man also has the characteristic of being mortal, so therefore Socrates is mortal. So you can see how these things connect. The second premise says that anything with the property of being a man also has the property of being mortal, and the first premise says that Socrates has the property of being a man, and then you can combine these to infer that Socrates is mortal. So, I want to just point out that you can reverse the premises. It doesn't matter which order they come. Saying either premise first doesn't make any difference. And let me just give you this pattern with an if and a then. Socrates is a man. If somebody's a man, then he's mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. And then our color codings. See how things line up. And we have the same argument just reversed. So here's a question. Why not use modus ponens? That is, why not use an argument like this, or add a premise like this, to make the argument valid? And I have a couple thoughts about that. One, if you add a premise like this, you don't really do a whole lot more than tell the audience, whoever's listening to you, any more than what they had before. So if you add, if Socrates is a man, then he's mortal, you're not really helping them out a whole lot more than just telling them, look, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Adding, look, if Socrates is a man, then he's mortal, might not really help them understand that connection much more than what they initially had. Second, and more importantly, suppose somebody asks, well, all right, so you tell me if Socrates is a man, then he's mortal. Why should I believe that if Socrates is a man, then he's mortal? Well, it seems like these general premises are good answers to that question. These general premises justify or explain premise 2 above. You know, if somebody says, I don't understand why I should think that if Socrates is a man, then he's mortal, if you respond to this person, look, all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, so he's mortal, or if someone's a man, then he or she is mortal, that explains why if Socrates is a man, then he's mortal. So adding general premises is better than going the route of modus ponens, or the route of pretty much saying, well, if the first premise is true, then the conclusion is true. So we'll get more on that in a little bit. All right, so let's get a second example. Here's an argument. Somebody says Adam is a student, so he's poor. So here we have an argument stated in logically valid form. Adam is a college student. All college students are poor. Therefore, Adam is poor. Same form as the previous argument. Now, of course, we can also give this with an if and a then. Are these two arguments logically valid? Yes, they are. And assume for the sake of argument that Adam is a college student, so this first premise would be true. But is it true that if someone is a college student, then he or she is poor? Not necessarily. Of course, there are some college students who are poor, perhaps many college students who are poor, but not all of them. So premise 2 would be false. And we can show it to be false with a counterexample. Find a college student who's not poor. All right, final example. Our previous examples were about Socrates and Adam, and this will be about running, sort of an activity as opposed to a person. So running, somebody argues running is a sport, so it requires expensive equipment, and we can have either of these arguments. Running is a sport. All sports require expensive equipment, so therefore running requires expensive equipment. Oh, hold on. Okay, so I don't have the little circles or arrows here, but you get the idea. These arguments would both be logically valid in that the premises lead to the conclusion. These arguments would not be sound, however, because at the very least, I think premise 2 would be false. Not all sports require expensive equipment. And I suppose you could, there could be some debate about whether running is a sport or not. We could likely ask what is meant by a sport, and we could also ask what type of running that we're talking about. So, but at the very least, premise 2 would be false, so these arguments unsound. All right, so here's the general pattern for what we've been up to. In all these arguments so far, we have a first premise that says that an object has a certain characteristic. And then we conclude that that object has another characteristic. So again, premise 1 says this object has this first characteristic, therefore this object has a second characteristic. And what we're doing is adding a premise in the middle, a general linking premise that says all objects with the first characteristic also have the second characteristic. Or if something, I call it X here, if something has characteristic 1, then that something has characteristic 2. So that's all we've been doing. Oh. All right, and we can of course visualize this with these circles. I want to point out that we can use other words to say the same thing. In terms of the object, we could also say the subject, the thing, the something, the entity, the noun, whatever word you think is best. So for example, objects or things or somethings, we've had Socrates, Adam, and running so far. Don't be offended that I'm calling Socrates and Adam things or something. We just need a word to describe them as some sort of entity or object. And I've also used the words characteristics, properties. We could also say feature, attributes, adjective, whatever. Use whatever words make sense to you. So the example characteristics we've seen so far are the characteristic of being immortal, being poor, requiring expensive equipment, and so on. So, with these different words, we can say sort of all objects with property 1 also have property 2. If something has feature 1, then that something has feature 2. All entities with the first characteristic also have the second. If a noun, this is talking loosely a little bit, if a noun has an adjective one, then that noun has adjective 2, or all x's that are A are also B. So you can say these same thing in a variety of ways. Just pick away and it makes sense to you. Okay, so to make an argument logically valid of this type of argument, we need to find a general linking premise. This is also sometimes called a major premise. I call it a general linking premise because it links up the stated premise in the conclusion, and we're looking for a general premise. So to do this, we need to ask a number of questions. First, what's the object in the stated premise? And again, you can use different words for this. Second, what's the characteristic claimed to be true of the object? That is the first characteristic, or characteristic 1. Third, what's the characteristic that's claimed to be true of the object in the conclusion? That is the characteristic 2. And finally, what's the general connection between that characteristic 1 and that characteristic 2 in the conclusion? So what premise best states that connection? So let's go back and look at some of our initial arguments. Earlier we had an argument, should say eating meat. Eating meat is morally permissible. That is, meat is morally permissible. That is not wrong to eat. After all, animals aren't rational beings. And there's an unstated assumption here that eating meat means eating animals. So stating this a little formally, we have a premise: animals aren't rational beings. Therefore, meat is morally permissible to eat. Okay, so here's the argument up top. What's the object in the stated premise? Animals. What's the characteristic claimed to be true of the object? That is the characteristic 1, that they are not rational beings. Or to put it in a different way, we have animals, and they are said to have the property of not being rational beings. Finally, what's the characteristic claimed to be true of the object in the conclusion? That is the characteristic 2. If you look and see, well, it's that they are not wrong to eat. So what's the general connection between characteristic 1 and characteristic 2? What premise best states that connection? Seems like either of these do well. Somebody says all beings that are not rational are not wrong to eat, or if something is not a rational being, then it's not wrong to eat it. So plug that first one in up top. Somebody argues animals are not rational beings. All beings that are not rational are not wrong to eat. So therefore, animals are not wrong to eat. We've got these two features, characteristics linking up. And again, of course, we could also have the premise: if something's not a rational being, then it's not wrong to eat it. And animals are not rational beings, so therefore, animals are not wrong to eat. So it's not wrong to eat meat. Okay. So this argument would be logically valid. The premises lead to the conclusion. You might, however, argue that premise 2 is not true because of counterexamples such as babies, severely mentally challenged people, and so on and so forth. There's all sorts of human beings that arguably aren't rational, but people think they would be wrong to eat nevertheless, which suggests that premise 2 is false. And of course, we'd have to try to figure out what we mean by rational beings. Maybe animals are rational beings. It depends on what you mean by rational. So there's more to talk about there as well. But I think it's pretty safe to say that whatever we mean by rational, premise 2 is not true. All right, next example. We can help starving children. Therefore, helping starving children is a moral obligation. So what's the object? Us, we. What's the characteristic? That we can help starving children. So we are said to have the property of being able to help starving children. What's the characteristic claimed to be true of us in the conclusion? That we're obligated to help these starving children. And so what's the general connection between that characteristic in the first premise and the second, and the characteristic in the conclusion? Let me give a couple responses. Somebody could go the route of modus ponens and say, well, the connection is that, well, if we can help starving children, we are obligated to do so. So the argument would be we can help starving children, and if we can help starving children, we're obligated to do so. And while that does connect the premise to the conclusion, I think it's not ideal. Basically because two reasons. First, everything that was said about modus ponens earlier applies. And second, it might make the argument kind of question-begging. A question-begging argument is an argument that assumes the conclusion in a premise. So suppose somebody says, look, helping starving children is a moral obligation. And then you ask why. And they say, well, if we can help starving children, we're obligated to do so. Maybe that premise just kind of is too close or too similar to the conclusion. Here's some other premises that I think are better. Somebody could add this premise. All actions we can do, we are morally obligated to do. And we can help starving children. So therefore, helping starving children is a moral obligation. This premise would make the argument logically valid, but it would seem to have the problem that premise 2 doesn't seem to be true. There's all sorts of actions that we can do that we're not morally obligated to do, and in fact there's all sorts of actions that we can do that would be wrong for us to do. All right, next attempt. Somebody says, if we can help someone, we are obligated to do so, and we can help starving children. So therefore, helping starving children is a moral obligation. Well, again, we could wonder, is this second premise, which I've labeled as premise 3, true or not? What if to help somebody you had to really hurt somebody else? Or what if you had to make a huge sacrifice in some way? Maybe those would be cases where you could help somebody, but you're not obligated to do so. So what I've labeled as premise 3 here might be a bit doubtful. All right, for the final attempt, I've kind of changed the first premise a little bit. Suppose somebody adds the general premise, if we can easily help someone, then we are obligated to do so. And then they change the first premise to say, well, we can help starving children, and it's easy to do so. From these both, we could conclude that helping starving children is a moral obligation. I think the premise that I've labeled premise 4 doesn't have the problems the earlier premises had, and so maybe it is true. And so if the first premise, what I've called premise 4, is true, this would be a sound argument. To figure out whether premise 4 is true, I think we'd have to do some investigation to try to figure out, well, can we help starving children? Is it all that easy to do so? You have to think about what it means for an action to be easy, and so on and so forth. But modifying this argument in this way, I think, would make it more likely to be sound. Oh, and here we have all these graphics with the connection. Okay. Finally, we have this argument, homosexuality is wrong because homosexuals can't reproduce. So premise 1, homosexuals can't reproduce, therefore homosexuality is wrong. First thing we probably need to ask is, well, what do you mean homosexuality is wrong? Suppose somebody answers, well, I'm talking about homosexual sexual behavior. When I say homosexuality is wrong, I really mean to be saying the more precise thing, that homosexual sexual behavior is wrong. Okay? So that's at least a clearer premise and a clearer conclusion. So we have this better argument. Homosexual sexual behavior is wrong because homosexual sexual behavior is non-reproductive. So we can state that formally is the premise and the conclusion like that. So, what's the object? Homosexual sexual behavior. What's the characteristic or property of that object? That the behavior can't lead to reproduction. What characteristic is claimed to be true of that object in the conclusion? That is the second characteristic, that the behavior is morally wrong. And so what's the connection between characteristic 1 and characteristic 2, and what premise best states that connection? So again, you could go the route of modus ponens, saying, look, well, if homosexual sexual behavior can't lead to reproduction, then homosexual sexual behavior is wrong. But at the very least, we're left wondering, well, why think that? Why think that's true? And a more general premise would give us an answer there. So here's a couple candidates for that. Somebody could argue, look, all behaviors that can't lead to reproduction are wrong, so therefore homosexual sexual behavior, since it can't lead to reproduction, is wrong. This would be a very broad premise that would be subject to all sorts of counterexamples. All sorts of activities can't lead to reproduction. Painting, driving a car, walking down the street, listening to this PowerPoint, so on and so forth. So this would be too broad. There's just so many behaviors that can't lead to reproduction, but they're not wrong. So that's not true. So another idea would be a more narrow premise, which would restrict the behaviors to sexual behaviors. And that premise would say that all sexual behaviors that can't lead to reproduction are wrong, and homosexual sexual behavior can't lead to reproduction, so therefore homosexual sexual behavior is wrong. So to think of counterexamples to this, we'd have to think, well, are there any sexual behaviors that can't lead to reproduction, but at the very least those aren't wrong or aren't always wrong? And if there are, that would suggest that this premise is false as well. All right, so here we have the visuals a little bit. We have, in the first argument here, we have just behaviors. So you see the little arrow linking up behavior to behavior. And the second premise, or second argument, we're focusing on sexual behaviors in both the premises. And it seems like there's probably counterexamples to both these. But I bring these in just to observe that different premises can make the argument logically valid, but they can be so general that they are subject to counterexamples. And they can also be so particular that they're subject to counterexamples. So since we're trying to see if an argument can be sound, we sometimes might need to try different premises to try to figure out if those premises are true or not. And we sometimes might need to change our premise, make it more general, make it less general, and see what happens. Okay. All right, so a little review of the concepts here. We've talked about arguments, premises, and conclusions. We've focused on the idea of logically valid arguments and adding premises or a premise to make an argument logically valid in the form of a syllogism. We've talked a little bit about syllogisms versus modus ponens. We've talked a little bit about more or less general and particular linking premises. In evaluating arguments as sound, we have occasionally asked, what do you mean? Premises often have various words that we need to figure out what somebody means when they say those words in order to figure out whether what they're saying is true or not. So we talked about meaning, clarity, precision, and that's all needed to try to determine if a premise is true. Talked about the idea of counterexamples a little bit, mentioned the idea of a question-begging argument. Question-begging arguments are arguments where the premise is more or less the same as the conclusion, maybe stated in other words, slightly different other words, and so the premise just kind of assumes the conclusion. All right, and of course all these issues can be explored in greater detail, and I think one thing that definitely needs to be explored in greater detail is the idea of an action being prima facie wrong, or a prima facie obligation, or an action being prima facie permissible. And we'll talk about those in another presentation. All right, for more on this, you can Google and or YouTube syllogisms. You can check out Richard Feldman's Reason and Argument book. See the section on simple moral arguments that covers what we just covered. And finally, I'm Nathan Nobis, and I have a little textbook on this material in progress. This is called Making Moral Progress, and my webpage is here as well. Okay, thank you.